Diolch yn fawr, Aled. Very, very kind indeed. Right, I'll get straight in there because I want to pack quite a bit in. A truly fairy place. These are the words of George Borrow. I was introduced when I spoke at the Plaid conference last year. Leanne Wood, the leader of Plaid Cymru, called me the 21st century George Borrow, which, as I said to her on stage, I'm not absolutely sure that's an entire compliment, to be quite frank. So, yes, George Borrow was talking about the Hafod estate out near Devil's Bridge, near Pontrhydygroes, here in Ceredigion, and I'll be coming on to talk about that a little later on. But what do we mean by the picturesque? Well, of course, nowadays it tends to be used as a synonym for sort of pretty or lovely. But I want to start with it as a very specific movement, of which I'm sure you're very familiar. And Wales was very much at the core of the picturesque movement, Wales and the Borders. And a very specific time too, so we can locate it here, we can nail it down to a time. I'll show you the birth of picturesque in a second, but it was the 1780s, and I think that really represented a moment when the views of Wales, particularly from across the border, changed quite quickly. Prior to that, Wales had been seen as a travelogue from 1700 described Wales as the fag end of creation, the very rubbish of Noah's flood. The Archbishop of Canterbury in 1740 described the landscape as the rubbish of creation, bit of a theme coming out there. And of course, Daniel Defoe, that absolute epitome of sort of bewigged gentility, he came to Wales as part of his 1724 tour of the island of Great Britain and was utterly horrified by almost everything that he saw, except the places that reminded him most of the sort of the home counties and all the rest of it. He loved Montgomery, he loved Denbigh in the Vale of Clwyd, he loved Tenby down in South Pembrokeshire, but he didn't have an awful lot of time for Meirionnydd and the mountainous parts of Wales. He found it quite horrific. So, of course, I would say, I think this is the premise really for this whole talk, is that kind of a truly fairy place and the fag end of creation, they seem to be exact opposites, but of course, they're probably two sides of the very same coin, and that coin being, you know, an unreality, a disinclination to accept the reality of a place and rather see it as some kind of cliche. And I suppose, as ever, the truth is between the two. So this was the birth of the picturesque in 1783, as much as we can nail it on anything. This book by William Gilpin. He was born in Carlisle in 1724, went to Oxford and was ordained there in 1748. And in that same year, at the age of 24, when he was ordained, he wrote his first essay, which was a dialogue upon the gardens at Stowe in Buckinghamshire. And he encouraged his readers to look at Stowe as you would look exactly at a landscape painting. So to see it sort of deconstructed in exactly the same kind of way. And that was easier with Stowe than it would be for, say, the wild landscapes of Wales, because Stowe, of course, was a formal planned garden full of follies and temples and grottos, monuments and artificial lakes. So, you know, you could look at it as a work of art, because indeed it was to some extent. But Gilpin wanted to take the same principles and apply them to nature. And he tried this with places in the south of England, along the River Thames and stuff, but he much preferred the rockier scenery that he found when he came west, and indeed back up in his native Cumbria as well. This is the frontispiece from observations on the River Wye, and you see, there it is, with relative chiefly to picturesque beauty. This is where the name of the movement came from. And his definition, Gilpin's definition of that, was that kind of beauty which is agreeable in a picture. Quite obvious, really. And it had a very precise order, according to the rules of Gilpin, a very precise order of components. A picturesque scene had to have side screens, a front screen, a background, and it had to have ornaments, things like what was on the ground, or woods, or trees, rocks, or buildings, preferably ruined, of course. And many adherents of the picturesque would frame their views either by taking around an actual empty picture frame or using what was called a clawed glass, which was a concave black mirror. And the idea was if the view was there, you would stand with your back to it and you would hold the clawed glass up and it would frame it in this concave black mirror, and that would create the perfect the perfect composition. And if you got it right, that was your picturesque composition. Critics pointed out that this said all you needed to know about the picturesque was that the way to appreciate it was to turn your back on the view you're supposed to be enjoying. But Gilpin, he loved the clawed glass. He described a clawed glass as giving the object of nature a soft, mellow tinge, like the colouring of a great master. So there we are again, nature as a painting. And of course, there were very strict hierarchies of the picturesque. Ruins and tumble-down cottages were far better than mansions or monuments. And he instructed his readers to take a very particular, precise route around the things and stop at only designated spots as told by them. So the whole thing was extremely prescriptive. And in a letter to his publisher, he said, he sort of summed it all up really, he said, if nature gets it wrong, I cannot help putting her right. And when he was talking about Piercefield down in Chepstow, one of the first sort of early romantic landscapes really, one of the first planned landscapes before the enthusiasm for the picturesque, Gilpin refused to find it. He said, no, it's not a picturesque landscape according to my rules. He allowed that it was extremely romantic, but not picturesque. And one of the reasons he won't allow it into his movement is the arrangement of the flowering shrubs at Piercefield. And he said this: "It is not the shrub which offends, it is the formal introduction of it. Wild underwood may be an appendage of the grandest scene, it is a beautiful appendage. A bed of violets or lilies may enamel the ground with propriety at the root of an oak, but if you introduce them artificially in a border, you introduce a trifling formality and disgrace the noble object you wish to adorn." So very strong language: trifling, disgrace, offend. These are and that's just from a simple flowering shrub. So you know he knows what he likes and he likes what he knows. This was his illustration of when he did the observations on the River Wye. He went in a boat from Ross on Wye down to Chepstow over 3 days. I suppose the most triumphant moment of the trip for anybody would be Tintern Abbey. And he illustrated his book with these very, very sober aquatint illustrations, this being Tintern. But if nature can't be trusted, as we saw with the flowering shrub, well, something man-made can even less so be fulfilling the object of the picturesque. And this is what he wrote about Tintern Abbey in his book. "Though the parts are beautiful, the whole is ill-shaped. No ruins of the tower are left which might give form and contrast to the walls and buttresses and other interior parts. Instead of this, a number of gable ends hurt the eye with their regularity and disgust it by the vulgarity of their shape. A mallet, judiciously used, but who durst use it, might be of service in fracturing some of them, particularly those of the cross aisles, which are not only disagreeable in themselves, but confound the perspective." And you can see that he has played fast and loose with the shape of the building. We'll look at a contemporary illustration from the exhibition upstairs by John Warwick Smith, of Tintern by Moonlight, and you can see that the walls are much higher, the gable ends are stronger. He hasn't applied the mallet of his mind's eye to painting it, as did Gilpin. And this is much more of a kind of classical landscape painting, really, Smith's moonlit view of Tintern Abbey. And this was done in 1789, so right at the sort of beginning, the outset of this new movement. And already then it's looking quite sort of old-fashioned. This is the kind of visual embodiment, I think, of Wordsworth's famous poem, Above the River Wye. And you can see how quickly things were changing. If we just go back a little further in the exhibition upstairs, back to Paul Sandby, his view here of Valley Crucis Abbey in Denbighshire from 1775. So just 10 or so years earlier, but this was such a time of rapid change that things have really moved on from then. Now here, Sandby's view is he really plays down the drama of the landscape. This is Denbighshire, the area around Llangollen. It is not short of dramatic crags and all the rest of it, and yet they barely feature on this rather sort of sober and demure view of Valley Crucis Abbey. Now Sandby started his career accompanying the William Roy, the guy who founded the Ordnance Survey, in going around and doing the drawings and the landscapes for the first survey of the Highlands of Scotland for what was to become Ordnance Survey. So he had a kind of mappy sensibility, if you like, and they were very literal, Paul Sandby's works, far more so than was the case with the picturesque practitioners, or indeed the sublime practitioners, because that all became part of the same age as well. The picturesque was placed between the beautiful and the sublime. And Wales particularly came to embody for many people the sublime, because the sublime really is the kind of picturesque with added vertical exaggeration. I mean, art historians will argue with that, I know, but that from a layman's point of view, that's how I kind of see it. And here we see a picture, again, from the exhibition upstairs, by William Gilpin's younger brother, Sori Gilpin, the view of Lake Llanberis and Dolbaden Castle. And the sublime was, as I say, the picturesque with added vertical emphasis. It was best defined, really, by Edmund Burke. He described it as whatever is fitted in any sort to excite the ideas of pain and danger, whatever is in any sort terrible or is conversant about terrible objects or operates in a manner analogous to terror. So that's the whole idea of the sublime. It is terrifying, it is awesome, it is literally awe-inspiring and awesome.